Okay, I think we are live now. So, uh,
Hello, Facebook family and friends. This is Moss from Investor Partner Group. I have CEO with me today. Hey, CEO, how are you today?
good. Thanks. Let's just wait for a few people to come on, and yeah, let's
Sure.
let everyone know what we'll be talking about today.
Yeah, so there has been a lot of traction going on the group, and people have been asking me, let's talk about how do you actually go about finding the growth properties in the growth suburbs, so suburb selection and the property selection. So we're going to talk a bit about that and how does the magic works there.
Awesome. Let's just see who's tuning in and make sure that we are actually live. And guys, if you're watching us now, just give us a thumbs up to let us know that we can that you're hearing us loud and clear, and the technology is working through okay. Just give us a thumbs up if you can hear us. Awesome. We've got some viewers. We've got Mason with us. How's it going? Awesome. Cool. So, Moss, today we will be talking about how to identify growth suburbs in and properties. And tell us a little bit more about this topic. I know you get a lot of questions around this, and since last week, I think there were a few people who had a few questions around this as well. Could you share a little bit more about the suburbs and indicators that you'll be discussing more about today?
Definitely, yeah. So in the last live, we talked or slightly brushed about how people have been focused more on the lag indicators versus the lead indicators or the predictors. And we are going to talk more about, well, what are those indicators and how do you assess them? How do you monitor them? And also, how do you define these indicators? How does this granular data work? What is the high level data? What is the low level data? So we're going to go into a bit more detail about the types of the indicators, what to look for, what not to look for, and how do the relationship between these indicators work. So those are some of the key things that we'll be talking about today.
Awesome. And just before we go into it, you mentioned there are a few different types of market indicators. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So I would divide the market indicators into 4 key categories. And so there is macro Australia-wide indicators where, there are indicators around what's happening in the country. Then there is statewide indicators. Then there is suburb indicators or the suburb profiles, and then the property indicators in itself. And we'll go into a bit more detail about what each of these indicators do, but let's take a step back and think, okay, so the 4 quadrants that I'm referring to, what's important to understand is some of these are qualitative, some of these are quantitative. It's not so much about the indicators, but it's more about the relationship between these indicators that would help you identify the growth suburbs in the growth market. Mm-hmm. And if you go down the path, okay, so let's talk more about, macro Australia-wide indicators. What does that really mean? These are highly tangible indicators. Majority of these are out of our control, so we don't control them. But what happens is these indicators play a massive, part in your wealth creation. So if you're not aware of these, you can potentially make a big mistake. Some of these are common incentives, interest rates, employment levels, amount of credit available, bank, how the banks are responding to some of these credit loans and etc. So I can talk about each of these indicators and spend hours talking about these. But we are going to brush on, and what we are going to do is then take in and seep through into some more granular data and talk more about those in the further sort of context. Now, if you talk about the state sort of indicators, so state or city selection, or what does that mean? So when you're talking about state or citywide indicators, you would hear media talk about these most, and how's the state doing, how's the city doing, the property market. Well, the truth is that these are not the true reflectors of an Australian property market or any property market in per se. These refers to infrastructures, jobs, gentrification. Yes, they play a bit of a role, but they do not define how an individualized property or a suburb property is doing. These also include, level of building approvals, supply, housing affordability, etc.
Yeah.
The third subcategory or the quadrant that you're looking at is the suburb indicators or the suburb selection. Now, this is where the true fun starts to happen. When you are talking about suburb indicators or identifying the right suburbs, you would hear majority of the people talk about only two indicators here. They would talk about vacancy rates and yields. And I would say to that extent that these are the two most abused indicators out there. And the reason is that there are more than 15 indicators just within this category where you can follow them, understand them. And these are the ones that would drive the real growth in the property market. Some of these that you can track and monitor are days on market, incoming supply, again, development approvals, etc. What's important is the trends in these indicators and their relationships with each other. An indicator in isolation does not mean much. And then the fourth quadrant, which is the most important and is very, very dear to the heart, is the selection cycle. So the selection cycle in itself, about when you're selecting the property, you are trying to understand what is the real potential of the property. Now, again, you're looking at another 10 indicators in this, where you're talking about location, school zones, land zones, development potentials, splitter potentials. How can you? So the fun hack in this indicator or in this quadrant is you're trying to assess and understand what is the development potential of the property, or what can you do to manufacture the equity in this property selection today. You can unlock, and this is what most of the people don't talk about. Yeah. So when you're talking about property indicators or property selection indicators, selecting the right property potentially means that your property is going to do 10 to 15% better than any other property on the street, because your property is a development potential property, or a renovation heaven, and these are the properties that grow faster than any other properties out there.
Yeah, fantastic, boss. And so seeing that there are 4 different types of market indicators, guys that are watching, I can see Lisa, how you doing? Thanks for giving us a thumbs up. And Basharat, Greg, good morning. Awesome. Good thing that you can hear us, because I'd hate to have gone through all these different types of market indicators and have no one hear us. So as we dive into this, guys, please drop into the comments your questions, and if there's certain things that Moss talking about that you want to dive into a little bit further, just make sure you drop that into the comments, and we'll make sure we'll follow up with those questions in this presentation. And if it's a big question, so even if you have there are no silly questions, make sure you drop them into the comments, and if we don't get to cover in this live, we will cover it in the following week. So awesome. So, Moss, you mentioned these 4 different indicators. What some of the viewers may be wondering, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you probably see happening, because they're either looking at one piece of the puzzle, maybe they're looking at some of the suburb indicators, but don't understand some of the state or different parts of the property indicators. And I know you'll dive into that a little bit more in this session, but could you talk a little bit about the mistakes that property investors are making, because they may only be looking at one piece of the puzzle?
Yeah, and as you said correctly, each piece of the data is a piece of a puzzle, and we'll talk about it in much more detail. But if you think from a mistakes perspective, majority of the people are looking at some of these indicators in isolation, or they're not looking at the relationships at all and making decisions. For example, as I said, people are looking at vacancy rates and yields only and making the decisions about the property. People would go out and do building inspections and and test inspections, and they will think that, or majority of the people will run a title search through a conveyancer, and they think that they've got enough information to make an informed decision about the data. Worst of all, some people would look at the age of the property and think, oh, because this property is really old, I don't want to get it, because this might not be an investment grade property. aging properties are developers heaven. They are one of the best kind of properties that you can get, because you can negotiate better, you can unlock the potential better, there is a better high best use. Again, I'm generalizing this a bit, but I think what people need to really think is understand how these relationships works. Don't look at these indicators in isolation, and think not so much in the medium term. Have a longitudinal thinking. So
Yep. Yeah. And so is there any other advice that you'd give them regarding these mistakes? What else could you advise property investors as they maybe looking into some of the components of these indicators?
yeah, and look, there's a lot of data available out there, and everyone has access to data. There's a lot of free information out there. But the most important thing that I would always tell any person who talks to me, or even to my clients, is it's the correlation of the data that's important. You need to understand the relationship between the indicators. Don't look at them in isolation. A data point by itself means nothing unless and until you look at the trends. If I can put it in the smart words, if I say that you can pack the dice such that you roll the dice and it's a 6 every time, then data is that packing material. Unless and until you understand the data and the correlations and the relationship with the data, you cannot roll a 6 every time. So
Yep. Awesome. So Dominique, hey, how's it going? I know you had a question, so please rephrase that question if to make sure we answer it if we haven't already. And for those who might be wondering or have a specific question around the types of correlation, I know Marcel's going to go into a bit deeper, but if you have those questions, make sure you drop that into the comments. Marcel, for the viewers who might be wondering, what are some of the common or actually, can you give us an example of some of the consequences of making these mistakes? And maybe there's some things that you've experienced yourself personally. Maybe there's others that you've seen go through these mistakes, and maybe there are viewers right now who might potentially be facing these mistakes today. Could you share some of the examples?
Yeah. And look, I think people absorb the content in very different ways, and everyone takes a different thing out of so much FOMO out there, or so much information out there. And some of the mistakes that I see people on a day-to-day basis is people thinking that big land is good, would go out and buy weird shape triangle blocks, thinking that just because the land is big the size matters. Or you would see first home buyers going out and not buying the corner blocks and buying a small middle block, whereas in the same state the corner blocks are selling for a lot cheaper. So, and then then there are people who would go out and buy properties without checking out the zones, without looking at the building envelopes, without looking at the trends for the last 6 months. So what that does is, if you're looking at historical or lag indicators, majority of the time you would either buy a non-investment grade property, or you would buy the property at peak. So and I can keep going. There is tons and tons of examples and mistakes that people would make in their portfolios, and and what are the consequences? So the consequences, grave consequences. So I saw this one client who was getting great yields in their property, but no growth, because they picked up the suburb looking at yield and vacancy rates. They thought, well, yield and vacancy rates, two big things, big ticks. Let's pick that property. Stagnant growth, no growth for the past probably like 8 years now. Then, I have another client, who was, pushed by a buyer's agent to buy a house and land package in a town center where infrastructure is going to come, but no growth followed, and they were like, well, there is this infrastructure coming. There was this town center building up, why didn't the prices rise? The worst thing that could happen to them was, they sold the property in 5 years' time because they didn't see any growth. And 6 months later, the property boomed. And, they chose the wrong time to even sell. So it's interesting, people believe that there are certain things that would cause the growth to happen, whereas the relationships and the indicators and the data are completely opposite. So it's important to understand that if you're not looking at some of these in a much more granular fashion. If you don't have the right experience and expertise behind you, that can push you back 3, 4, 5, 10 years, behind the wealth creation life cycle that you have. So.
Yeah, awesome. And guys, for those of you who are watching, if you have potential worry that you might be thinking about as you're approaching your investments, or maybe you've got investments at hand and you're looking for another perspective, raise the questions here. We can dive into that today. One of the questions we've got so far from Yawa, I hope that I'm pronouncing that properly. What are some of the best websites? I think you might have mentioned this earlier, Moss, but what are some of the best websites to be able to get access to some of this data?
Yeah, so look, we collect data across 1,500 suburbs in Australia. We tap into insights from CoreLogic, DSR, RP, Codel, ABS data, DEC, Price Finder, Investor. So we collect data from various sources. What I tend to tell people is you would find that a lot of data sometimes conflicts. So for example, I've been told this numerous number of times. You look at hashtag and Suburb Finder and Price Finder and Investor together, and they would all tell a different story. And that's why what I tend to tell people is, don't believe the tool, believe the data. So get hands on the data, the raw data, and do your own analysis. Look at the trends, look at how those trends are coming along, understand the targets in the range, and then make those informed decisions, rather than a tool telling you whether this is a growth suburb or the growth is going to come, because they might be looking at something that does not make sense.
Yep. Yoa, I hope that answers your question. If you have any more questions, feel free to shoot that through. Moss, was there anything else you want to cover around costs or consequences around some of these mistakes? And I think you keep mentioning that even though you can point some people in the right direction as to where to get the data, there are some precautions as to what part of the story that they might be looking at from a particular website. Anything else on consequences of costs?
Yeah. Look, the important thing, again, and I keep referring back to myself, and I feel that in my head I'm repeating, that data and information needs to be translated into insights. Yeah, and that is where the story really comes out. People focus on the data as information, and they'll make decisions based on that. The insights is where you would understand the correlation and help you make an informed decision. So understand that process in the journey. Don't look at the data in isolation and thinking, okay, and we're going to talk about two of these use cases where if you look at the data in isolation, that does not make sense. But if you combine the two data points together, I think that would provide you a completely different sort of view. So yeah.
Yep. Awesome. So Yoa, let us know if that answers your question. Moss, what indicators are we going to focus on today? I know there are many different, and you've spoken about 4 types, and within those 4 types, there are multiple micro types within those 4 types. But today, what indicators do we want to focus on?
Look, I wanted to focus on the 2 indicators. They are one of the really, really good predictors of the market, but they are the most abused indicators of the market as well. So what we are going to talk about, and I'm going to pick gross yield as an example. And gross yield, people would talk time and time again, gross yield and vacancy rate, and you would hear every, person, talking about these, 2 indicators, because they're easier to find, they make a lot more sense in isolation too, but when you look at it in isolation, they do not empower you to make decisions. What you need to combine together when you're looking at the gross yield is the 12 months of the rental growth that the suburb is expecting, or the rental growth that a particular property has seen. Okay. If you are not combining the 2 together, basically what you are saying is you're expecting snowfall to happen in Melbourne, for example. It's utter nonsense to just look at yield in isolation and not combine it with the rental gross trend, at least for the last 12 months. I suggest people to look at 24 months, but even at least for the last 12 months. And what this does is I'll tell you a quick sort of hack here. So what happens is majority of the time when you're seeing that the rental is increasing or there is a rental growth that is happening, it is usually or generally followed by the price growth. And the reason that happens is that when the rental demand is going up in the area, potentially it's signaling a few things. It's signaling that people want to live in that area. People cannot afford to buy in the area, but they want to really, really live in the area. It also signals that the gentrification is going to really soon happen in that area, because while people fell in love with the area, naturally they would want to buy it in the future. So it's a consistent sort of trend. So if there is a consistent rental growth, and I would pick a percentage as a target percentage of over 5% that has happened over the last 12 months. That is a really, really strong indicator that the sustainable demand is going to come in the area pretty soon. Now, if you combine the two factors together, you would be in a much better position to make a decision about whether a particular suburb is good or a particular property in a particular street is good, is a good buy or a bad buy. If you look at a gross yield, for example, where the yields are tracking at 5%, 4% over the last 5 years, and they've been stagnant, that potentially means that there is no demand in the area. Yes, it's a great yield, but that doesn't indicate that there would be future demand coming in the area. Now, I use this example quite often, where you look at Southeast Queensland, and Southeast Queensland, you can see that the yields were always there. You look at the past trends for 5, 6, 8 years, and there were always great yields in Southeast Queensland. But the rental demand is not as strong as you would expect in other parts of Australia or other property markets. So there is a massive opportunity cost that you're looking at. And that's why I always call out and say, is the demand sustainable? Would this keep happening? And that is where my nervousness comes into play. If the demand is not sustainable, that means that the growth is not sustainable.
Yep.
So yeah.
Awesome. That's very valuable. And guys, let us know if there are things that you're getting out of this live, and if there's anything specifically you want to retouch on. So as Moss mentioned, the two things you want to look at is gross yield, as well as at least 12 months forecast on rental gross trend. And that kind of answered a question we've seen from other investors who might be fixed on a particular location or property because they're looking at one indicator such as gross yield. And you've actually answered a question that some of the viewers might be having around should I be investing in Southeast Queensland? And from what you've shared so far, even though the gross yield looks amazing, if they're not looking at the rental gross trend where there's not so much of a demand, they could be. So what kind of implications might they be looking at without considering the rental gross trends in a specific location?
Potentially, if there is no rental growth coming in, or there is no indicators for rental growth coming in, that there is no demand that is going to be created for a particular property in the future or a particular suburb in the future, which means that without sustainable demand, there is no sustainable growth. There might be a specific spurt in prices because of X, Y, and Z reason, but it's not consistent, it's not sustainable. And those are the key factors that you should be looking at, when you're looking at, data incompletely. Now, again, we are only talking about 2 indicators. There are more than 15 indicators in one quadrant and 10 indicators in the other quadrant. We are super generalizing everything. We need to look at the tangible and intangible indicators, qualitative and non-qualitative indicators in totality to make that informed decision. But we are using this as an example as to how people are making decisions just based on gross yield.
Yeah, and I know we've talked a bit about some of the consequences or potential implications of not looking at different indicators, and I'd love to go into some of the benefits and results of actually making the right choices by considering the right indicators. And Moss, I know you're very cautious about this, and even from my inquiries regarding property, you've advised me on a few things on what to look out for, what not to look out for. If you were to give a few tips, even though you have already, if there are for those who might be looking at a particular suburb, but maybe they're missing out on a particular indicator, what advice do you want to share with them in this live?
Look, the important thing is, follow the indicators and stay away from FOMO. Yeah. So don't just follow the trend and follow the crowd, because, media, I always say this, media is here to entertain, and they'll always entertain you. You follow the media, sometimes you might hit a jackpot because you might have bought it, at the low, and the media drives the prices up, or, there are other people who are driving these prices up, whether it be buyers agents or educators. So you have to be very careful in listening. I always tend to tell people, don't listen to me, don't listen to anyone else, listen to data. Evidence-based investing is what you should always be doing, and create the gems within your portfolio where you're adding development potential properties, so that these properties will help you come out of the serviceability trap, and you're hitting these traps.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Moss. And one thing that I recall when inquiring about property and investment, one thing you mentioned was because there are a lot of different experts out there and advisors regarding property, and some may focus on particular indicators and some may or may not. What were some of the key things that you learned in your journey, even though you had your own mentors and advisors? What were some of the key things that stood out for you?
Look, what I've realized is, being in the industry for, this long, is that 99% of the time people are not looking at the data in a much more granular level. Yeah. They are collecting pebbles from the shore. They are not diving deep into the ocean to collect the gems. So I always tend to tell people, limit the consumption of what you're consuming as far as the content goes, but ensure that you feel empowered to make these decisions. Don't just go with the flow. Don't just, anyone who points a finger at a property, don't go out and just buy it. Also, one of the learnings that have had is, always follow people who have seen multiple property cycles, because people, who would be in the industry for the growth that has happened in the past, 4 or 5 years, and they would see a property, growth happen in that 4 or 5 years, and they will say, oh, this person have an X, property portfolio. That's amazing. That's great. But what you really, really need to consider is, how did this person do when the property market was going down? Because that would be a true indicator of, did they survive that downturn? Did their properties still held their valuation while the market was tanking? So always look at people who have survived the property life cycles, because they would be the one who would be truly sharing their experience with you, rather than people who are really new to the industry.
Yeah, fantastic. And I'll come back to this in just a sec. I've noticed there's a few questions in here. So James and Dominic will get to this in just a sec. And for the other viewers out there, make sure you drop in your questions. I'm going to open up for a little bit of Q&A to answer any of the remaining questions. But Moss, just as you mentioned that some of the things that you took out from your experience, even though you had your own advisors, for the viewers out there, what are maybe 2 or 3 questions that they can ask any expert or advisor regarding property, so that they can see or get answers to more than one indicator? What are a few key questions that you would advise viewers to question other experts and advisors, so that they're able to get a better perspective on indicators?
And anytime you're reaching out to any of the advisors, whether it be investment consultants or, buyers agents or, property, educators, I think what you need to be really clear is what you're trying to achieve. Where are you in the property life cycle right now? You might have 10 properties or you might have 0 properties. The number, I always say, does not really matter. People would sell the financial freedom to you. What you really want to understand is, that you need to capture the growth as early as you can. So you need to understand what does that growth trajectory look like. And two, money is finite. So there's no money tree in anyone's backyard where they can shake and get the money from there. So if the money is finite, you need to make sure that you are getting the best bang for the buck. So you're optimizing your portfolio. So that strategy needs to be outlaid up front as to what are you going to do and how you're going to do it. What are you going to do when you hit the serviceability trap? Because I can guarantee you would. So those people need to identify some of these bottlenecks up front and help you or guide you in that journey. Now, there are people who might have already started their property journey, and they would have accumulated wealth, and they would have captured 2, 3, 4 properties. Where their starting point should be is the review and remediate. Because people always fall into this self-serving bias where if I bought a property, I always try to protect the decision-making process, saying, well, this is a good property and I'm going to get a growth here. Well, let's not be self-serving, let's be, very, very objective about some of these decisions. And if it's a wrong decision, let's remediate, move on, and, jump on, because the more you wait, the opportunity cost is the growth that you're moving on, that you're losing on the other side.
100% and totally valuable. I think I need to rephrase the question. So for example, let's say for some of the property investors that are out here, maybe considering property, but they're getting different questions or different advice from different experts and advisors who may be looking at particular indicators in order for this property investor to make a better decision. What kind of questions do you recommend that they ask a property advisor, just to make sure that they cover all the indicators as much as possible?
Well, the important thing is to ask them the relationship of these indicators. So if there are people talking about yield and vacancy, look at the other indicators, look at days on market, look at OCR, look at auction clearance rates, and ask these questions about how do they relate to what I'm looking at. What does the stock level means? What does that mean that there is so much incoming supply? Why is there so much incoming supply in a particular area? What is that going to do for the future of the property if I buy a property in an area where there is 20 developers developing 4-unit sites? What is that going to do? It's going to saturate the market and bring the prices or flatten or stagnant the growth. These are some of the questions when you're talking, or buyers agents or the people are presenting the property, or real estate agents are presenting the properties to you, that you are asking them or trying to find the answers yourself.
Yeah, fantastic. And guys, I hope that's of value for you guys. And I can see a question here from James, which relates, who asks, how does proposed infrastructure play a part in the buying decision, if any?
Look, infrastructure in itself means nothing. I always say this. People follow Bunnings around and saying, wherever the Bunnings is going to come, I'll go and invest, in those suburbs. Well, it's worked for some people, but infrastructure in itself does not mean anything. Okay, what's important is to consider what is the employment levels, the jobs that area is going to create. Okay, how much is the incoming supply that is coming in together with the infrastructure? Is there new developments that is happening in the area? You need to look at some of those together to make the decision. For example, if there is brand new infrastructure coming where there is hundreds and hundreds of acres of land available, the growth would be very, very stagnant. It's not going to increase substantially. So you need to balance these factors together when you're looking at and making these, decision making, or when you're looking at property investing decision making. So.
Fantastic. We've got a question. Actually, I'm not sure if it's a question. Dominic, let me know what you mean by that. So Dominic's mentioned it'd be good to go through thoroughly tangible and qualitative. Not sure what you mean by that, but Moss, if that resonates with something you mentioned earlier.
Look, as I said, there are 15 indicators that, when we're looking at the suburb profile, and there are probably about 10 indicators when you're looking at the, property selection, indicators. So what we are planning to do is we are planning to do a bit more live and, bring some of these indicators back and have those conversations rather than, providing all those indicators in one session, because that would just be an information overload. People would not be able to digest. So The intention is to take it slowly so that, we are educating the people and helping them understand as to what these indicators are, how do they play their part, what is the target that you're trying to achieve in some of these indicators.
Yeah. Fantastic. And guys, just before we wrap it up, if you do have any more questions, let us know in the comments. But Moss, you mentioned this weekend. Actually, there was one other question. I'm trying to remember. It was actually, do you have any predictions for the Melbourne market? That was the last question I had for you.
Yeah, so yeah, I get asked this question a lot, and people do tend to put me on the spot and say, hey, what are your projections for the Melbourne market? One thing that I can guarantee is no buyer's agent would ever tell you this. Yeah, so I've tested that numerous number of times. People tend to hold these areas to their heart and thinking, oh, if anyone finds out, that's my bread and butter, for example. I love transparency and accountability, so I will share some few suburbs, between 750 to 800 sort of mark. That is the sweet sort of price point. But what I'll do is, I'll share that on Friday. So we are doing a site visit in Sydney on Friday. Join us on that live, and what we'll do is we'll share some of those insights there while we are meeting some of our clients, doing a site visit and meeting some of our friends down in Sydney. How does that sound?
Awesome. Fantastic. I'm looking forward to hear some of that. And guys, so if you're wanting to hear more about some of the Melbourne predictions predictions for the Melbourne property market, join us on Friday. Approximately what time will that be, Moss?
Look, we'll probably be on the road from all the way from 9 to like 5. So we'll go live at different times, showcasing different areas of who we meet, how we meet. So stay tuned. Follow the group, follow the page. It would be somewhere around midday where we are meeting a lot of friends, and we'll open up the can of worms and see how other people feel about Melbourne and what their feedback is, and what do we feel about Melbourne.
Yeah, fantastic. And if there's anyone here that has any further questions or wants to look in a bit deeper into what you've been talking about today, how can they reach out?
Look, feel free to either private message me. There is a Calendly link in the comments. Feel free to reach out and book in a time with us. Drop in the comments. Ask any questions. I'm all up for accountability and transparency. My aim is to share as much information as possible out there, so that people can learn and make informed decision making when they're buying their properties.
Yeah. I've just read a few comments that have just popped up. Maybe it's my data. Dominique mentioned we were going to go through. Yeah, so hopefully that answers your question, Dominique. Please reach out. To go through all 15 indicators and the components of each will take more than an hour. We've been about 45 so far. So do feel free to get in touch, and we'll be able to help you with that. Yawa says, based on the indicators discussed, which suburbs do you think are good to look at in each state? I think if Moss hasn't already answered this, and please share, correct me if I'm wrong, Moss, but you'll be sharing some of this on Friday, in particular around the Melbourne. In regards to other states, is that another live? Is that something you want to touch on here and now?
Definitely. Look, we will be touching about each of these states, and we'll be dropping these gems every Friday. So stay tuned. I'm making a commitment that every Friday, we will come out and provide some of this feedback across, and why do we believe some of these areas are going to see more growth than others.
Yeah, fantastic. I can see Lisa's looking forward to Friday. And Dominic, if you haven't been in touch, we'll be going to Sydney on Friday. So get in touch if you'd like to know more. But yes, we'll be in Sydney on Friday. So looking forward to meeting some Sydney people there. Any last comments before any questions come up, Moss? And I'll wrap it up in the next couple of minutes if there aren't any more questions.
No, look, as I said, data is very close to the heart, and evidence-based investing, that is the key takeaway for today.
Yeah. Fantastic. Awesome. You are, yes, looking forward to Friday. Take care, guys, for now. And actually tomorrow, if you have any questions around tax structures for property investment and business structures, do join us live tomorrow, the same time around 10 a.m., where Sohail will be talking about different tax implications and answering your questions from there. Thanks, Abdul. And Jen, says, what better choice, buying the best house in an okay suburb? Is it better to buy is it better to make to buy in an okay suburb, or buying the worst house in the best suburb?
Look, it depends on what it depends on what you're trying to achieve. So I always measure every decision that I'm making about property in three things. Are you trying to capture yield, growth, or profit, or return? So, so think from those three perspectives. I always try to chase growth and return, and rather than the yield, because I can generate yield whenever I want, because we are in small scale development. So we build that as wholesale. The difference between an investment property and a primary place of residence is tenants. I always say this. So you can generate yield by putting a person in there and start generating rent. So your question is much more broader. Don't think from in a two-dimensional way. Think from this perspective, and you're always thinking about property investment. What are you trying to chase? Yield, growth, or return? I am chasing growth and return. What are you chasing? That's my question to you, generally.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, generally to answer that, and if we haven't answered that, we'll answer that in another live. Amit has asked, what tools do you use for data? I think we've covered that. If we haven't, Moss. So guys, if you've just joined in, do watch it from the replay. This will stay inside the group, and you'll be able to access everything Moss has discussed today. Until tomorrow, we'll see you with Sohail talking about tax. And if you have any questions, make sure you do continue to drop them in the comments, and we'll answer them in the next lives. But other than that, we'll see you tomorrow and Friday for those of you joining us live in Sydney. Take care. Bye for now.
Ciao, guys. Take care.